Hi there, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Edward Achorn, the Pulitzer Prize finalist and author of Every Drop of Blood, the momentous second inauguration of Abraham Lincoln. He's the author of 3 books, including 2 about baseball, which I'm sure are going to find their way onto this show at some point. But Every Drop of Blood is on numerous best of lists and is the number 2 best-selling Civil War book of 2020. Thanks so much for being here, Mr. Achorn.
Thank you, Evan. Call me Ed.
Ed, all right, perfect. And I'm Evan, the Evan and Ed Show. Before we start our interview, I do want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We're going to donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. We are witnessing history as this episode is being released. On January 20th, a new president is going to be given the oath of office, and he's going to stand before the nation with a task similar to what Abraham Lincoln faced in 1865. How do I unify people who are deeply divided, not just over the nation, but over the president himself? Now, I don't want to overdo this comparison because what could compare to the Civil War? Not much. But over the last 4 years, let's face it, America has seen politically driven violence, demands for equality, and even hundreds of thousands of people die. Before we get into Lincoln in 1865, explain how inaugural addresses are more than just symbolic of a new era.
Well, right. I mean, they are the way an incoming president expresses a vision of America to the people. And that's a pretty important thing. Lincoln, of course, used his 1865 address to do something that no other president did and or ever would do, which is not to gloat about the impending victory of the Union forces in the Civil War, but to blame both sides for the sin of slavery and to try to urge everybody to realize that and come together without animosity or vengeance. And to me, I don't see any politicians on the horizon willing to do something like that.
Lincoln's address in 1865 is not only one of his finest speeches, but is maybe one of the greatest speeches ever given in America. Describe Abraham Lincoln's mindset as he emerges from electoral victory and as the Civil War seems to be nearing an end. You said in the book that he seemed to feel he owes an explanation for the agonies the country endured on his watch. In other words, he took it on himself to try to explain what they had all been through.
I think Lincoln suffered immensely during that war, and he had a way of searching his own soul about these things. And he wondered, he was engaged, he thought, in a noble cause of preserving the Union and putting an end to slavery. And he wondered how a just God could drag out this war, make it so horrific, invade so many families' homes with tragedy and loss. And he wondered, how could a just God do this? And he concluded that this fight had to go on until the great sin of slavery was removed from America, and that this was a judgment on both sides. And I think he found that a politically useful or important argument as the war neared an end, because he wanted to say, in contrast to many other or every other politician in the country, he wanted to say that both sides were at fault, that slavery was something bigger than both sides, that God's actions were something no human being could have contemplated at the start of the war. And through that means to try to unify the country and try to ease some of the fears in the South, which were tremendous. I mean, there were politicians in the North who wanted to viciously punish the South and leave it essentially a moonscape, and impose Republican rule on the South, which eventually was done. And Lincoln sought to use this inaugural address to try to bring both sides together. And it was, as I write in the book, it was not received that way in the South or by Democrats in the North.
But
go ahead.
He famously said, "Let him up easy."
Yes.
Let him up easy. That's his mindset.
He from the start of the war, his only interest, really, his central interest was in unifying the North and the South. And he famously wrote to responded to Horace Greeley by saying, if we could have slavery in a union, I would support that. If we could have no slavery and a union, I would support that. I mean, and at that point, he was ready to unleash the Emancipation Proclamation, but he still made that argument. He wanted to bring the country together in a union, and he tried to do it initially without touching slavery in the southern states, and he eventually had to touch it as a war measure. The Emancipation Proclamation was essential, which freed the slaves in the states that were in regions that were still opposed to the Union. He eventually had to do that as a war measure, and that was, in his view, the essential military weapon to win the war and bring this country together.
Let's get a little bit biographical here of Lincoln. I was thinking back to some of his other big speeches. I thought of Cooper Union. I thought of, although it's not a speech, but the Emancipation Proclamation, Gettysburg, and then you have the second inaugural. And he, of course, gave hundreds of, if not thousands of speeches over the course of his career. But let's have you describe how Lincoln learns to recognize big moments, not only in his personal life, but in American history. Where did he develop that sense of importance from?
Yeah, he developed as a writer. He developed in every way in his life. He had this amazing knack of learning and growing that was unlike any other politician in that era, and maybe in our era. He grew up very poor. As everybody knows, born in a log cabin, and his father was worked with his hands as a farmer and a carpenter. And Lincoln grew out of this into this. He educated himself. He had almost no schooling, and he developed a passion for politics because he loved being with people. He didn't reveal himself to people, but he loved that sort of interaction. And as he went along, he developed as a speechwriter. He wrote, but in some of his early speeches, he had very compelling phrases and arguments. But as he developed, he became better and better at it. And I think more than any president of his era, maybe any era, maybe up to JFK or Reagan or something like that, he was able to use his speeches as a way to just grab the public's attention. He famously, probably his most famous early speech was when he was running for the Senate in 1858. And he cited a line from the Bible, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." And he argued that this country could not go on being half slave and half free. It would have to be all one thing or all the other. And he hoped it wouldn't take a civil war. In fact, he argued it wouldn't take a civil war to make that happen, but slavery would have to be deemed by the country as an evil that would eventually have to fade away. And that speech solidified his position as a Republican leader in Illinois, and also led to his nomination in 1860, I think, because he so gripped the people of Illinois with that, and it was a speech that was very controversial at the time, because it was the people in the South suggested here he's saying the country cannot survive half slave and half free, and that's what it is. But it definitely propelled him, and his use of language. He loved the Bible. He loved Shakespeare's language, and he was able to incorporate these into his speeches in a way that's, I mean, it's just beautiful literature reading this to this day. And I think the second inauguration was his greatest speech. And it was filled, it was 700 words. It's delivered in 5 or 6 minutes, but it's filled with this sort of passion and recognition of suffering and deep thought about the human condition. That's, I can't imagine any of today's politicians approaching it. I don't know if that answers your question, but he did use language and speeches to really grab the public's attention and arrest their attention and make them focus on why we were fighting this war, what challenges we faced, why this was the moment for the United States to do the right thing.
And when did he realize in his life that he could do that? That he could shape the public?
Baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware. And there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
No. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
Well, he argued the most powerful thing in American government is the opinion of the people, and that he very early on plugged into the people in his districts. So I think he very early on understood you've got to make this connection with people. You've got to. He used humorous stories to make connections with people. He used very homey comparisons or metaphors, and so very, very early on he understood this, and he just developed as a writer. People, I mean, the first inaugural was very beautiful. It had a passage at the end about appealing to the better angels of our nature. But the second, by the time of the second inaugural, it's almost like something out of the Bible. It's so profound, filled with wisdom, filled with an understanding of suffering, and I just think it's magnificent.
Well, and we are going to talk deeply about what is in this speech itself, but let's set the scene of Inauguration Day itself, March 4th, 1865.
That's right.
Let's describe Washington, D.C., if we can bear it. The description in the book is not exactly flattering. It's this muddy mess. Half the people there are ready to party, or maybe more than half are ready to party. It is a party town in general. Let's, describe what we would see if we could be on those same streets that are there right now, but 150 years ago.
Yeah, well, I can't express it as well as I did in the writing of the book, but generally, I mean, it was a city of these incredible buildings. I mean, the White House, the Capitol, but there was mud. There was dirt roads. The city was famously divided between mud and dust. When it was warm in the summer, the dust, the cow, the horse manure, just flew up and got over everything. When it was rainy, it just turned into this yellow muck. And so there had been days of rain leading up to this inauguration. So the Pennsylvania Avenue was just covered with this yellow mud, and that was a combination of that and dust, dirt, horse manure, everything.
And it's a very seedy town. I mean,
it is.
Let's be clear here. There's more than a bar or two.
Oh yes, there's prostitution all over the place. I write about the different levels of prostitution. There were A-rated houses, and then ones that were very dangerous and unseemly. But it was a city that had sort of burst beyond its seams, because all of a sudden, a very sleepy southern town with not a lot going on besides government, and then all of a sudden it turned into the center of this vast military effort and a government that was bigger than anyone had ever imagined it would be. And so the city was just filled with tens of thousands of people coming in. It had grown exponentially in its size during the war. And so people were living in all sorts of conditions, and escaped slaves had come there because of the fighting in Virginia and so forth, and Maryland. They just flooded into the city. And so there were criminals wandering around. It was a dangerous place and a smelly place.
And it was gross. There's also the second thread in the book, and thankfully they don't collide in the time frame that this book covers. But John Wilkes Booth is lurking in Washington. How did he find himself there, or how did he get there? Why is he there, and what is he already planning to do?
He's a major character in this book. He's a famous actor. But he had sort of suspended his acting career because he'd become so passionately devoted to the cause of the South. He thought Abraham Lincoln was a tyrant who was destroying the Constitution and destroying the way of life of America. And he felt something had to be done to stop this man before he totally destroyed America. And on that day, he was stalking Lincoln. He was able to get into the inauguration ceremonies in the Capitol, I believe, because he was dating the daughter of a New Hampshire senator who happened to be a abolitionist Republican of all things. And he was able to get into the Capitol. And when Lincoln was leaving the Senate chamber, where his vice president had been sworn in, and was walking out to the platform, somebody who they later discovered was Booth slipped in behind Lincoln, was walking out right behind him, and somebody managed to stop him. There was almost no Secret Service protection back then. I mean, there was no Secret Service. There was virtually no protection of the president. So this guy slipped in behind Lincoln, and they were able to stop him and question him, and they let him go. But 6 weeks later, when he killed Lincoln, one of the people at that ceremony realized, oh my God, this was Booth who was walking behind Lincoln that day. And there's a lot of speculation that Booth intended to kill Lincoln at the Capitol that day.
And it appears he's in the picture, right? There's one picture. I mean, maybe.
There's a picture, everybody says it's him, and not everybody. People think it's him, but I have my doubts, and some people who are much more an expert in these matters than I am have their doubts too. But Booth did describe himself as being in the crowd, very close to Lincoln, and he easily could have gotten out there even after he was stopped, because they let him go away. Then he could just turn around and come back in. It was fairly chaotic. Mary Lincoln couldn't get out onto the platform until his speech was almost over, and it was just somewhat chaotic. It's hard to believe that it operated in those days in that way, but it
Yeah,
did.
now they I mean, of course, Secret Service, I mean, there's thousands of them, but now they bring down the inaugural procession one person at a time, and they all take their assigned seat, and everything is bright and gleaming, and there's not a speck of dust anywhere on the platform, on the viewing stand. So
Yeah,
it's certainly a lot different.
yeah,
On page 111, you have a beautiful description of Lincoln. You say that with his perfected reading copy in hand, he exits the White House in his fine new Brooks Brothers suit and stovepipe hat, climbs up into a small carriage, and in the wind-driven rain of the early morning, before the massive crowds could block the streets, he splashed his way through the mud of Pennsylvania Avenue to the Capitol. It's a striking scene, and it's wonderful because one gets a real sense of how sort of quiet and humble Lincoln was comfortable being. And then he gets to this Capitol dome. In Team of Rivals, Doris Kearns Goodwin has two pictures, one on the front and one on the back. And at the beginning of the Civil War, the dome is under construction, and at the end, the dome is finished. Maybe that's too much symbolism to even describe with words, but let's have you take a crack at it.
Well, Lincoln was very determined to go through with that, even though it was very expensive and it took away manpower and resources during this war, the struggle for the country's survival. But he was adamant that the Capitol dome would be completed as a symbol that the country was going forward. The country had not been divided. The country was still the United States of America. And that was a very important symbol for him. And they did manage to finish the dome in time for the second inauguration. And it was, among other people, Walt Whitman, the great poet, who wrote about how striking this dome was, how brilliant and beautiful. And it meant a lot, I think, to the people of the country that this symbol of the American Republic went forward in the face of everything else.
And the country had not just gone through a war, you wrote. You also say it had moved towards freedom. So it's not just about going through this war, it's about moving towards a new kind of country. And you say that Black people were in the inaugural parade for the first time. That's a striking moment. Describe what we would see if we were there in 1865, what we would see in terms of whites and Blacks getting along with one another.
Right. Well, Lincoln famously called it a new birth of freedom. It was a different kind of America where Blacks and whites were citizens. And at the second inauguration, there were Black soldiers. This was something that would be not dreamed of in 1861, 4 years earlier. And they were prominent at the second inauguration. And then Black people who wore their finest clothing came out in huge numbers to hear the inauguration. I mean, I don't know if they could hear it, but they went on to the Capitol grounds. And there were many descriptions of Black women wearing colorful dresses, their finest clothing, to honor this man who had emancipated the slaves and changed America forever. And I think that's part of that poignant scene that day. Of course, the most famous Black person there that day was Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist leader, who was standing near the front of the crowd, listening to Lincoln. He was not able to get into the Capitol building because Blacks were not permitted into the Capitol building that day.
And we are going to talk about what happens later at the White House. So let's save that for the end, because it's an extraordinary moment. But I don't want to make this a memory test for you, but describe the program order as best you can. So Lincoln gets to the Capitol building. Take us moment by moment through this whole proceeding here before he gives his speech, and it's not the way that it is now, where the VP and the president give their speech at the same their oath of office at the same time. So describe what we would have seen had we been there.
Well, the morning was this windswept, rainy tempest type thing. I mean, the wind blew so hard that it, as Walt Whitman describes it, woke up some of the sleeping congressmen who were still. They had done an all-nighter because they were trying to pass legislation before the end of the Congress, which took place. The end of the Congress was that day when the new one was sworn in. So they're madly trying to pass legislation up to the last minute. Lincoln went up early in the rain instead of participating in the parade because he wanted to sign these bills as soon as they came to his desk. And the people had to have tickets to get into the inaugural festivities, so they all lined up. But it was so crowded, some people had to be lifted through the windows to get in time. The ceremonies were in the Senate chamber, and that's where the former vice president, Hannibal Hamlin, was brought in, the new vice president, Andrew Johnson. Johnson had been sick leading up to this event. He had gone to a party the night before and apparently had
the party kept going.
a few drinks. And then the next morning, to stiffen his nerves, he had a couple glasses of whiskey, large glasses of whiskey that Hamlin provided for him. And by the time he got in there to do his inaugural address, he was evidently drunk. And he had this crazy, he's supposed to speak for something like 10 minutes, and he went on this extended 30-minute harangue where he's talking about how we all owe our power to the people, and he's haranguing the members of the cabinet, and poor Lincoln, who was behind putting this guy in instead of Hannibal Hamlin, has to show up and sit there and listen to this harangue with a very pained expression on his face. Finally, they're able to get Johnson off the podium and proceed with the events. So they marched through the Capitol to the steps of the Capitol, and that's where Lincoln sat down with Johnson and then got up and read his speech. And I believe the speech at the time was delivered before the actual swearing in. So he got up and he read this address that he, 700 words that he went over and over again. Really, he wrote this speech for years. And Lincoln had a way of very slowly writing speeches and going over it again and again and again until he got the wording perfect. And that's what he delivered this day. And then there was a chorus singing a grand choral theme about American democracy and the president. And then he left. And a while later, I believe they had lunch at the Capitol. And a while later, he got into his carriage, and that's where Walt Whitman saw him waiting, and he was ready to leave. And then all of a sudden, his 11-year-old son, Tad Lincoln, came running up and jumped into the carriage, and that they proceeded with the parade back to the White House.
When Lincoln takes the lectern, does it actually get sunny, or is that hyperbole?
That's right. No, that's one of the striking things of this day. It rained all day. It finally let up. Women's dresses were being ruined, which was a big deal back then, because dresses were expensive, and it was just the prized possession of women. And here they are trailing their dresses in the mud. But the rain let up a bit, and then they decided to go outside onto the platform. And when Lincoln was making his speech, all of a sudden, the sun broke out brilliantly. And he said later on, it made his heart leap. And it was many people at the time took it as a symbol that the long suffering was over. And Lincoln is heading into a second term. Everything's going to be brighter now. Everything's going to be better. And they have no idea that some guy in the crowd is going to kill Lincoln 6 weeks later.
There are 3 sections that I want to talk about, and I've quoted them here. I'm going to probably, I guess I'll post the entire address in the notes to the episode, but let's talk about 3 sections here. And we hear one of these sections, the point that Lincoln makes, debated to this day: was slavery the cause of the Civil War? Let me read the section.
Great.
1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern half part of it. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. And you say that Frederick Douglass, watching this address, had a significant reaction to that. And all blacks now had a clear message from their leader that this was the root of the evil of the Civil War.
Yeah, Lincoln made a statement. Lincoln was the first real analyst, I think, of that war, what it meant, what the historical importance of that war was. And he said it was about slavery. And that is something that Frederick Douglass had argued for years. This war should be about slavery. It should be about ending slavery. And he had been bitterly disappointed in Lincoln, both in his first inaugural, saying he would defend slavery where it was, and also during the war, how slowly he moved towards emancipation in Douglass's view. So Lincoln is saying that this war was about slavery was a very powerful moment in American history, and he was defining that war as it wasn't about states' rights, it wasn't about economics, it was essentially about this institution of slavery. And Lincoln admitted in that little passage that it was essentially that it was a very strong economic part of the South, and it was it made it very powerful and very difficult to remove.
The next section I want to ask about is this part here. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. He's always got a little rhyme in there, a little twist of phrase that works. Yet if God's will, he says, that it continue, yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood is drawn with the lash, there's your title in the book,
yes.
Shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said for 3,000 years ago. So still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. How did Lincoln start to put the death that America had seen over the last few years into these words on paper? And he also brings up religion in that section. I probably didn't read it as clearly and cleanly as Lincoln did, but you can go in the show notes and read that little passage there. You said Lincoln's hard life have left him with the thick scar tissue over his psychic wounds, an expectation of disappointment, given the long futility of his struggle to shine in a world that seemed to be against him. So what was it about his childhood and religion that made him so capable of capturing this mood of misery? He says, the mighty scourge of war. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray. Where did that all come from within him?
Yeah, God knows, but it's he had grown up under very trying circumstances, I think, and he had been disappointed throughout his life by a series of defeats. When he was 9 years old, his mother died of this freak condition. The cows that they used for milk had eaten a weed that was not deadly to cows, but it was deadly to humans who drank the milk from the cow who had eaten this weed. And that's how his mother died. Just this horrific blow from out of nowhere. And his father left Lincoln and his sister in the care of a teenage relative, and he'd gone back to Kentucky to try to marry another woman to take care of him and the children. But he left these children alone in the wilds of Indiana, and they almost starved. I mean, they were dirty, filthy. They were eating dried berries that Lincoln's mother had picked and left behind. So you can imagine what a painful and transformative experience that would be for a child. I mean, that's as abandoned as you can be, practically. And then during his life, he talked about this frequently. He had an expectation of disappointment, and he was disappointed over and over and over and over again. He lost 2 runs for the Senate. He served only one term in the Congress, and he was very unpopular when he left that term. He tried to gain a government position, and the new Whig president wouldn't give it to him. So he had suffered defeats over and over. And I think this gave him, I mentioned scar tissue, I think that gave him a kind of strength to endure disappointments and defeats all through that war, which were constant. I mean, I can't imagine anyone but Lincoln having the stubbornness and the ability to accept pain the way he did. What else were you asking?
I was just asking. I mean, you answered the question. I mean, that's how he learns to put the death that America had seen over the last few years on paper.
And he also, I want to mention, he also had developed very early on, I think, from his parents' religious background, this idea of fatalism, that God controls things, that people don't ultimately control their fate. They can influence it, but things happen beyond people's ability to control them. His favorite line was from Shakespeare's Hamlet. There's a divinity that shapes our ends, rough hew them how we will. When we all we can do is roughly hew roughly shape what we want to do, but God ultimately has his own purposes, and we can't always see them. And I think this kind of fatalism sort of protected him and kept him going. He had a belief that ultimately things would turn out the way God wanted them to. And that's infused all through the second inauguration, that God had a different plan than either North or South understood. This would be far more revolutionary, far more radical, far more devastating to the country than anyone had predicted. And but it was, he posited that this was just in the face of this because the crime of slavery was so great.
The last passage I want to talk about is maybe the greatest passage of American writing ever. Certainly by a president. I agree
with you.
Yeah, certainly by a president.
Yeah.
With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we're in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to achieve and cherish a lasting peace among ourselves and with the world, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and a lasting peace among ourselves and with the world. Now, does he say the world, or he says all nations? I believe he says all nations.
Yes.
But that's a stunning moment. When he wrote it, did he understand it would be repeated for centuries?
I don't know if he understood that. He initially said, I don't expect this speech to be as popular as my other ones immediately, because it's posits that people don't really know what they're doing, that God has a different plan than their own, and people don't like that. But he said eventually, I think it will become be seen as one of my more important speeches, and that's clearly what it was. I think malice toward none and charity for all really struck people. I mean, that phrase is so beautiful. And binding up the nation's wounds. I mean, that's literally true. There were, hundreds of thousands of wounded men young men around the country, horribly wounded. And he had this wrecked country that he was trying to bind the wounds and move forward together, not as enemies, not as people bitterly opposed to each other, but as fellow Americans. And that is the greatest task. I mean, I write in the book about, the horrible divisions in the country by that point. And
what's the immediate reaction to the address? And we should also ask how John Wilkes Booth took it, sitting there watching that day.
Yeah, I think Booth was deeply unimpressed.
I bet. Yeah.
The Southern press viewed it as horrific, that this man was a zealot who was going to wish God's punishment on the South. They totally misread the speech. The Northern Democratic press was equally disturbed by it. They thought, where does this guy get off talking about God's will? He's just a politician. Why is he dragging God into this? And how can God be part of this horrific war with all this suffering, all this bloodshed? And so it was very divided. The Republican press, some of the papers got what he was driving at, some didn't. Horace Greeley, for instance, thought it showed no compassion and sympathy, and he liked his first inaugural better. And he ran the first inaugural on the page next to the second to prove his point. But of course, we view this as a profoundly compassionate speech, and it really did work, I think, to bind the country together, however flawed that mending was. And how people remembered those words for a long time.
And also how brief the feeling of unity, I guess, would be. Describe the scene with Frederick Douglass at the White House. We alluded to it earlier, or at least we set it up earlier, but describe what happens that night. There's a party. Abraham Lincoln is greeting people. He had the foresight to wear gloves, which we would appreciate in our COVID era, as he shook hand after hand. Describe what it would have looked like if we could have seen Abraham Lincoln in the White House that night.
Well, Lincoln had a public reception that night, which he had done from time to time during his presidency. But the reception permitted people from all walks of life, all Americans from all levels, to stand in line and go into the White House, shake his hand, and then move along to the East Room and then out of the White House. And Douglass, who was not permitted to go into the Capitol earlier that day, resolved to go to the White House. He had met Lincoln twice in the White House, and he thought he'd be able to go to this reception and get in and shake the president's hand. And the guards there stopped him at the door and said, no, Black people are not permitted into the White House. And Douglass persisted. They let him in at one point and let him out a window in the East Room. And then just to trick him and lead him outside. And he came back. He insisted on getting in. He finally got some help from, I believe, a member of Congress, and he was able to get in. And he stood in line, and when Lincoln saw him, he said,
he makes a big show. Yeah,
he makes my friend, Frederick Douglass, and Mr. Douglass. And Lincoln asks Douglas what he thought of the speech, and Douglas said, "Oh, you don't want my opinion." He said, "Oh, I do too." And Douglas said, "Mr. President, it was a sacred effort." And that was Douglas's view of it. He was often bitterly critical of Lincoln, but he found this speech saying this war was about slavery and slavery was a great crime. He thought that was incredibly profound.
What was Lincoln trying to show? I cut you off there for a second, but what was Lincoln trying to show as he says, here comes my friend Douglas, and he says it out loud so all the people around can hear?
I think Lincoln didn't have a racist bone in his body. He did admire Douglas. He did realize the kind of influence he had. Douglas, when he came into the White House, said, and we got to understand this was a completely different society back then. The society had relentlessly propagandized that blacks were inferior to whites, almost a different species almost. And Lincoln had no prejudice. He brought Douglas in. He was interested in his ideas. He had a respectful discussion with him.
And Douglas said at one point, he's the only white person in power who ever reminded me that he and I share different places in society.
Right. He said he's the only one who didn't make the unpopularity of my race a point in the discussion. And of course, Andrew Johnson, who followed Lincoln, grievously offended Douglas by doing just that. So Lincoln was able to, probably because he came up from poverty himself and worked as a field laborer, he was able to deal with all people at all levels of life, and he respected people. He understood that people at all levels of life are intelligent, have something to contribute, and have something to say of use to them. So he recognized Douglas's keen intelligence. I mean, Douglas is, he's the second character in the book after Lincoln, and I write about the arc of their relationship. I think that's one of the driving narratives of the book, how Douglas really detested Lincoln. He considered him a craven politician. And as the war went on, as he saw what Lincoln was doing, he came to have a very different opinion of Lincoln. He came to admire him greatly.
Would the speech have been seen as so good if Lincoln hadn't died, a month and a half later?
I think so. I mean, look at it, listen to it, hear the beauty of the language. I think it would be. I think it would always be a beautiful treatment of that horrific war and all the suffering that people endured during that war. So I think it would have been. I think, though, after what happened after Lincoln was killed, is he became a martyr, and it became fiercely politically incorrect to criticize him in any way. So what was whitewashed out of history was all the bitter hatred he endured as a president. I mean, he was vilified in the press. He was considered a tyrant. I write about this at length in the book, about how much his enemies detested him and how he just persisted and kept on in spite of this nonstop barrage of hatred. And he did have the people of the United States behind him, and he did have the soldiers behind him. And that's what sustained him.
No one can be Abraham Lincoln, and it wouldn't be fair to compare any president to Abraham Lincoln. Certainly none that are, certainly none of the last, 50 years or so, and probably of the next 50 years. But I guess who knows? Abraham Lincoln is, a legend of American history, and the speech is obviously legendary, as we've described here. What should every president what page should every president take from Lincoln's second inaugural to inform their own speech writing as they prepare to give an inaugural address? What did he leave behind that a president can emulate?
I hope they would emulate his love of America and its institutions. He fought this war, this horrific war, because he considered America the last best hope of Earth, that its free institutions, its ability, its governmental structure that permitted people the ability to rise in life the way he did. He considered this of inestimable value. And I would hope whoever is president would understand that. And he also had a unique ability not to hate his enemies. He viewed the people of the South. He said, I think in his Cooper Union address, if I was in the South, I would have the same attitude towards slavery as they do. I mean, this is the conditions they were brought up in, and this was their economy. So I think he didn't vilify his enemies, which is something very rare. The Republicans, the radical Republicans he worked with in Congress, wanted to punish the leaders of the South, the people of the South, so they would never again attempt to rise up against the United States. And they wanted to protect the Black former slaves in the South. And they thought the Southern establishment would not do that. So Lincoln was, I mean, he did not believe in a course of punishing his enemies. He believed, look, we can disagree on politics, but we have to come together around this beautiful concept of America, its free institutions, its ability for people to rise in life. And that's what he fought for his whole life.
Edward Achorn, the author of Every Drop of Blood, the momentous second inauguration of Abraham Lincoln. Thank you so much for joining us.
Evan, thank you.
Certainly check out that book and also his website, edachorn.com. He's also on Twitter at @ed_Achorn. I do want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We're going to donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports, History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Be sure to check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axel Bank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. We'll see you next time. Thanks.